I am going to talk today about the use of intelligent agents, continuing off of the conversation from this morning in applications for continuous auditing and monitoring. What I'm going to discuss is a framework that is part of a larger project that I'm working on with Professor Miklos, Yugu, and Kelly Dwan. We are coming at this from a slightly different angle because we are looking at this from a risk perspective through the incorporation of agents into the procurement process. This idea of building a heavy train on a light rail comes from our speaker, who I was talking to yesterday after his presentation, Dan Neer, who was on the practitioners panel. One of the things that I asked him was related to the potential consequences of very robust and quick adoption of artificial intelligence without many guardrails. I don't know if anyone has been keeping up with the headlines, and I don't know if it's worth keeping up with the headlines, but you know, the president-elect for 2025 has very optimistic outlook for artificial intelligence. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is, are we prepared to be incorporating artificial intelligence into something as sensitive as audit? And if so, how is it we should be going about it? What kinds of things as auditors and accountants should we be thinking about? And his response was, you know, this idea of building a heavy train on a light rail, but also that we as accountants and auditors are particularly well positioned to be able to deal with this because of our risk orientation. So I thought it was particularly appropriate to update these slides to include his quote. And I'm happy I had no spelling errors after several glasses of sangria at dinner last night. So basically, this is an adaptation from Professor Miklos' earlier work from 2006 on intelligent agents, where we are identifying the primary features that these agents should have. And we've already gone through extensively throughout the course of the morning how these agents can potentially function. So I won't spend too much time here. But what I do want to talk about is the extended features that we should consider for the purpose of continuous auditing and monitoring. When we're incorporating agents into a process like the procurement process, which is just one example of, you know, the areas of accounting that we can be considering incorporating intelligent agents, we need to consider both the internal and external perspective. So if we're doing so for the purpose of internal audit, continuous auditing and monitoring, we want the agents to be able to have appropriate controls in place to prevent things from going wrong, or as I've heard other people allude to it as going rogue within the system. And of course, when you're doing prompt engineering with large language models, you try your best to have a replicable output, but at the end of the day, it's they're non-deterministic, so you don't always know what you're going to get. So this idea of being able to override and having some authority within the structure of the agents is very important, as well as the adaptability, which more comes from the perspective of an external audit focus, right? So if we are external auditors, we need to be able to adapt what it is that we're doing from one environment to another. We need to have that focus in mind when we're thinking about designing these agents. So the hierarchical structure, I know Maher just alluded to the dynamic structure versus the sequential structure of agent development. The approach that we looked at this through was the hierarchical structure, the sequential structure. And the idea here is that, similar to an audit engagement, which Marcos spoke about a little bit yesterday, you have different roles that are able to oversee and supervise as you would in a non-agent environment. The other important piece that comes from proper accounting practices and a risk focus is the proper segregation of duties, which is something that we can also consider as we're developing these agentic systems. So the hierarchy, this is actually adapted from a computer science paper, and the hierarchy of agents that makes sense to us in an audit environment involves the strategy agents at the top, followed by the planning and managing agents who delegate the work to the task agents. And these task agents are experts in their area. So you may have coding agents that are able to do analytical tasks. You may have more accounting function agents that are able to do tasks that are more specific to accounting. So here is an example of certain task agent classifications. And actually, after Maher's presentation, I have a whole kind of new view on how to potentially think about the function of these agents and how to derive them. But nevertheless, here we have some postulated categorizations of task agents. So the agents are divided based on what their primary objective is. So if you're talking about managing data or accessing data, you have a classification of data agents. If you're talking about performing analysis on that data, if we'd be focusing on the analysis agent categorization, and then transporting the information throughout the system, either internally or externally, would fall under the umbrella of the communication agent. One thing that I want to point out here is the highlighted, the bolded tasks in these various categories. And this is going back to what I was mentioning a moment ago about this proper segregation of duties. So as accountants, of course, we're trained to separate the functions of authorization, possession, and the reporting functions. So as we're developing these agents, to make sure that no agent has the ability to do more than one of those things, just as you would in an accounting environment, becomes very important. The other idea that we introduced in this framework is the idea of policies. And these policies are designed to basically be a layer over the agent operation. And they're split into two different categories. One, which would be a company-wide policy. So policies that relate to the values of the organization and the risk management practices of the organization as a whole, versus function-based policies, which relate to each individual component of the accounting cycle or the business cycle. In this case, we're talking about the procurement process. So to break this down a little bit further, when we're thinking about best practices for design, we use the AICPA audit data standards to help us, because we need some kind of framework to be able to develop the system of agents, whether it's being manually designed or, in part designed by an LLM itself. So just wanted to highlight the elements of the procure to pay process. And we're going to show one small example of the agentic flow. But here's going back to what I mentioned a moment ago, how these policies kind of overlay the process of, how these policies overlay the structure of the hierarchical structure of the agents within the framework. And we introduced the risk-based approach that I mentioned a moment ago. Again, because we're talking about continuous auditing and monitoring, so this can include having some kind of thresholds that are set by the company with respect to their operations and their goals, or it can, and it should be done through the lens of what can possibly go wrong. So this is where we introduce the risk framework for accounting, and essentially we need to be able to have the agents map these various risks to the tasks that they're assigned to do. And perhaps a neural network would work quite nicely here to be able to map these things together autonomously. So here is an example from the procurement process, which is an applied project, as I mentioned, that is still in its very early stages. So basically you have some activation function, which can be circumstance-based or it can be time-based. In this case, we're looking at, if I just flip back briefly to this process, we're looking at the very first step in the procure to pay process, which is the identification of a supplier. So when a prospective new vendor comes about, that would be the business activation function. And now it's time for the agents to go to work. So we'll begin with the top layer of the pyramid, which is the strategic agent. The strategic agent's job is to align the company policies and the function policies with the task at hand. So, for example, the strategic agent may be looking to, as its underlying goal, the strategic agent is to determine if the vendor, the prospective vendor, should be approved. And if so, to collect the information necessary to have within the business environment that for that vendor to be onboarded and approved in the system, and to be in line with all of the policies of both the company and the function. So the first thing that it has to do is extract the relevant policies at the company level and the process level, and basically determine all of the steps that need to be, determine all of the checkboxes that need to be met in order to make the determination as to whether or not to approve the vendor. And there's many reasons, of course, in an organization why you wouldn't approve a particular vendor, and it's generally based on risk. So the strategic agent would then delegate the task to the planning and managing agent. The planning and managing agent's role, again, that second step in the hierarchical structure, is to determine which specific task agents are required to get the job done. So in order to do that, they have to, as I mentioned, match the policies to the risks to understand what they need to be aware of and what tasks actually need to be accomplished in order to get to the end objective. And from there, they will select the task agents and give the task agents their particular jobs. From the planning and managing agent, the delegation goes to the task agents, and in this particular case, we have 5 task agents that are assigned. You have a compilation agent who's responsible for collecting the information relevant to making that decision. And that can include communication. So you'll see the third agent down is the communication agent, whose job is to potentially facilitate negotiations. And please bear in mind that, as many of our speakers have mentioned, we need to always be aware, because this is auditing and accounting where the human in the loop becomes necessary. So is it realistic to believe that we can fully automate a conversation to negotiate preliminary contract terms between an agent and a prospective vendor? I mean, certainly not today, but I think the important point to make is that at all points in the process, we need to be aware of where the human becomes relevant. Then we have tasks such as the analysis. So all the information is compiled and it's included in our system. Now it's up to somebody to review that information and make a determination or a recommendation about whether or not to approve. Again, we don't necessarily want agents to be able to autonomously make these decisions themselves, but it could be dependent on the company's risk. Do they allow the agents to take that level of autonomy, or do they escalate up to a human for the ultimate approval? Once all of the information is collected, including the recommendation, there is another data agent whose job is to store that information. And then finally, as one of the pillars of intelligent agents is the ability to communicate and traverse the system, we have a data agent whose job is to access the necessary the information when it becomes necessary. So for the opportunity, if the opportunity arises where we're going to issue a purchase order to our prospective vendor, we're going to need to re-access that file and the information within it. This is just one component of the entire process. So imagine now that you have this, but replicated for, not replicated, but recreated for each of these individual steps. So each function will have the ability to communicate with other functions to obtain the information that it needs to be able to do its job. And I thank you very much for taking, oh, I went the wrong way.